I'd just like to start by thanking Leonie and the AMS for the invitation and for making it possible for me to be here today. Thanks, that lets me be a bit more mobile. Just for your information, I'm deaf. If you ask a question, I'm probably going to try and get a bit closer to you to hear the question better. Okay. As Leonie says, this invitation was extended when you were under considerably drier conditions. The talk was supposed to be aimed at the effect of dry weather on ethyl application. We've never researched that, but we've got some data we collected over the years that gives us some indications of what we can expect under drier conditions. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of an introduction about climate change. I mean, it's a very topical issue, and the question everyone, well, for quite some time has been asking is climate change real? I don't think we doubt that too much anymore, but the question has sort of shifted now to, is that climate change crisis human-induced? I'm not going to debate that. I'm sure we all have our own opinions. But just a bit of background. This is a sort of chart that this was put together in 2008, so the data is up to 2008. This is the sort of data that the deniers would put up in those years and say, well, look, CO2 is increasing, but the temperature differential is decreasing. So how can we talk about CO2 and temperature or climate change being correlated? That was a bit deceptive because this is actually data taken, it's a small part of the data taken from a much more extensive chart, that one. That data covers that period there, a very short term. This is a much longer period, just over 40 years, and you can see over a longer period, there's definitely a correlation between CO2 and temperature, or temperature deviations. And if we put up some more extensive data, going back 400,000 years, we can see that our climate has always been subject to changes in CO2, and that CO2 correlates very strongly with temperature changes. There's no doubt that there's a correlation between the two. What's worrying, this chart is a few years out of date. Currently the level sits at around 410. What's worrying is there's been no response yet to that CO2 produced by human industrialization, and that's what got everyone on edge, is where the temperature is going to go. I'm not going to say too much about that. A lot of us will find out for ourselves. On a more personal note, this is the minimum, average and maximum temperature from the area where I live. You can see there's been gradual changes in all of those. We used to get regular frost in winter. I don't know of anyone who's experienced frost in the last 4 or 5 years. Those temperatures all increased between 2 and 6 degrees. So we're certainly noticing a change. The ARC, for who I work, has a climate division. It does some climate modeling in 2015. I'm just going to put up a few charts now about what we're looking forward to. I'm sure the climate model is operating in Australia who can put up similar data for you. But that's our situation in 2015. Our hottest areas are in the Northern Cape. That's areas where we receive maximum temperatures well over 35 degrees, primarily during our summer. We can look forward in 2090 to that hot area extending all the way through to Luvubu, which is one of our more traditional macadamia growing areas. If we look at minimum temperatures, 2015, the central parts of South Africa subject very routinely to frost in winter. That's our grain-growing areas and a lot of temperate horticultural crops, which require a winter chilling period. By 2090, we probably won't have that chilling requirement. Looking specifically at climate modeling for macadamia, and this is under irrigation, by the way. At present, Luvubu, in that little green square, is optimal for macadamia. Nelspruit, the Lowveld area where I come from, the main growing area at the moment, is also optimal at present, as well as Natal Coast. By 2090, Luvubu will not just be suboptimal, it will be unsuited to macadamia production, even under irrigation. The good news is that the optimal areas will expand slightly in South Africa. Well, not slightly, quite enough. However, that's under, as I said, under irrigation. If we look at rain-fed macadamia production, at the moment around Richards Bay on the northern Natal areas, that will move to around Mthatha in the Eastern Cape, and that's our only optimal areas for rain-fed macadamias. We're not going to be able to grow macadamias without irrigation in the future. Well, we can't do it now. So definitely more planning required in terms of water supply in the future. So that's the predictions for us. Forecasts, just something to bear in mind with forecasts. The forecasters do get it right, but not always. Anybody familiar with that little beast? Yes? No? Okay. It's a groundhog. That's in Canada. You've all heard of Groundhog Day, even if you've never seen a groundhog. This little chap gets hauled out in Canada near the end of winter out of his burrow by his handler, and the way he reacts on that particular day they've selected, they make a forecast on how much longer the winter is going to last. And if you look at some of this information, you'll see he's right about 40% of the time. So that's not too bad. Okay, Phil, as he's called, has made the movies. There's the figure, that's the exact figure, 36%. If you look at some of the climate models that have been put in over the years and compare it to the actual data on that black line and how the models predict the data, the climate model is all right about 5% of the time. So maybe there's a role for groundhogs. I don't know. Yeah, we're in Australia. I've shown you some of the South African weather. Let's talk a little bit about Australian weather. That's the temperature anomalies over the last 120 years. And what's important, most important, is the colors. Anything in a shade of yellow, orange, or red means above average. Green is below. And the last 7 years for you have been quite phenomenal. Red over there, red on these charts, that indicates a significant increase in temperature. You can see that the highest records were achieved in this last year. Rainfall, very similar, well, not quite so similar, except in the last year. That pattern of change in rainfall is not quite so consistent, but the last year has been extremely dry. So that dry weather combined with the extreme heat is what led to the fires in Australia, or contributed to them at least. We've heard a lot about the Australian fires in South Africa. I think there was a news story several times a week about how severe it was, the worst fires in living history. But the older people in the audience might know it's not the worst in living history, and the data supports that. That's the most recent fires. There's been at least 5 previous events that were more severe, but quite some time in the past. So we just got to be wary of the sort of perceptions created by the media. So climate events, individual events are becoming more severe. What are the implications for agriculture with these increases in the extremes? Increased temperatures. We can expect increased temperatures to give us increased evaporation. Some people will say, great, more evaporation means more moisture in the air, more clouds. Just bear in mind that you're in the business of turning sunlight into macadamias, so you've got more cloud. You're probably looking at a negative effect on production. That's something I think that's being researched at the moment, but certainly probably needs a bit more work. Okay, getting on today's topic, Ethephon. You call it ethyl, by the way, we call it Ethephon. Ethephon was discovered in 1965 and was first registered as a pesticide. Funny enough, not a growth regulator. There's the IUPAC name, 2-chloroethylphosphonic acid, and it is an acid. I'll say a bit more about that later. And it's metabolized to release ethylene. That's the important one. The Ethephon itself, that Ethephon molecule does pretty much nothing, but once it's metabolized to ethylene, that's when you start to see things happening. There's the metabolic pathway. I'm not going to say much more about that. Okay. One of the things to bear in mind, it was believed for some time when hormonal research in plants, or growth regulator research in plants, started, that abscisic acid was actually the hormone responsible for abscission. That's not the case. Auxin interacting with ethylene is the the deciding interaction as to whether excision is going to happen. And there's a little bit of a blurb there, but that's not important. Okay, ethyl. It's been around a long time, so a lot of chemical manufacturers manufacture it. They all give it their own name. That name is normally indicative of what they're registering it for. For instance, bromoflor is used, it's the same product you use, ethyl, but it's called bromoflor to induce flowering in bromeliads, pineapples. Harvest, the name given to a product used for harvesting. So you get the message. There's a lot of versions of it on the market, but they're all pretty much the same thing. What they all have in common is they release ethylene when metabolized. What does ethylene do? Well, you could call it an all-in-one molecule. There's a lot it does. It can be used to induce flowering, suppress flowering, ripen things like cane and fruit, inhibit growth, fruit and leaf abscission, seed cane sprouting, and in the case of cucurbits in particular, you can even use it to change the gender of the flowers. So male plants which don't produce fruits with the correct treatment at the right time will produce female flowers. How does ethylene work? Well, most significantly, it's a signaling molecule. Okay. It's defined as a plant hormone, and its signaling functions go according to a number of factors, one being the plant status, the phenological state that it's in at the time, environmental conditions, and it has organ-specific roles. It has effects on certain organs at certain times, but not others. Just to give you an idea of how well their signaling works, I'm putting up a non-agricultural related example. In Africa, giraffes and acacias are very well associated. It's their food of choice. When a giraffe starts to feed on an acacia, one of the first reactions of that plant is to produce a number of molecules which are distasteful, firstly, and secondly, if the giraffe continues to feed on those leaves, toxic, can cause death. At the same time that process is happening, ethylene is released and carried downwind. And it's been shown that acacias within 50 yards, roughly 50 meters downwind of the affected acacia, can also start producing those toxins. Of course, you can see the signal moves downwind. The downwind trees which haven't been predated on start to produce those molecules. The giraffes have evolved to this in that they now feed in an upwind direction. They always move upwind of the tree that they're feeding on. So in general, it's been noted that giraffes will browse on 1 in every 10 acacias in an upwind direction. So what do we know about ethylene and stress, which is what we're here to talk about? It's regarded as a stress-responsive hormone. Plants under stress produce ethylene. We apply Ethephon to get ethylene in the orchards, but if the trees are under stress, there's already ethylene present. So that really is what we're talking about today. What is the effect of putting additional Ethephon and plus ethylene onto trees that are already producing? One thing to bear in mind about ethylene is not just it doesn't just have a signaling effect in plants, but also in other organic or other organisms. For instance, fungi will often respond to ethylene in a positive way. They will grow. So trees that are under stress producing ethylene are probably more likely to be susceptible to, say, fungal contamination. Okay, briefly I'm going to go through some of the trials we did over the years. There's probably about 8 or 9 years worth of data. I'm not going to talk about all of it. I'm just going to cherry pick some of the highlights and to make some points. That was one of the first trials we did in 2001, where we sprayed various rates of Ethephon onto Beaumont. Most of the charts I'll talk about are Beaumont, and you'll see on the bottom axis the rates I quote are always in parts per million. They're not moles per 1,000 liters. So if you see something that excites you, don't go and make up a tank according to those figures. It won't be right. And most of the trials we did were in the May-June period. I understand your cut-off date for Ethephon applications is considerably earlier, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So that was our very first year's trials. We were a bit cautious. We'd worked with it in lychees before and managed to defoliate some trees, so we kept the rates a little low. Year 2, we went in with higher rates, up to 2,000 parts per million, and noticed in the same orchard getting much lower effects at the equivalent rates used in the previous season. So that's the first thing that came out of this, is not every season is the same. And at that stage, we weren't sure why. Well, still not sure. It could have been a temperature-related phenomenon. There's a lot of different reasons. But what we noted over all the years that we did the work, that's a more typical response for Ethephon on Beaumont. Between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million, you get a saturating effect. It's not really worthwhile putting more than 1,000 parts per million. Okay, and from that previous figure, that's the sort of crop response to Ethephon application. The blue lines are the yield in the year that we made the application. The red lines are the yield in the year after application. And you can see, regardless of how much we put in, yield in the treated trees increased in line with the yield in the control trees. The next bit of work we did was to try and get a bigger effect out of the Ethephon without putting in those high rates. Now we picked up in the literature that there's a number of adjuvants you can add to your spray mix, and particularly we got a lot of useful information from their experience in the olive industry. They had used urea and phosphates, and even in one trial had gotten a drop of olives using just phosphates. So we started to look at how we could mix those two products with our Ethephon. If you look at this chart, you'll see the blue dotted line there is a response in this trial to Ethephon alone. The yellow line is with urea added to the mix. The purple line is with a phosphate source added to the mix, and the brown line is with urea phosphate. That's a product that contains both urea and phosphate. And you can see that where we put urea and phosphates in, we get a much bigger response than with the Ethephon alone. If you look at the nut drop pattern, you'll notice Ethephon and Ethephon with urea are giving the biggest drop around 24 days after application, and with phosphates in the mix, we're getting the biggest drop just 10 days after application. So that seemed quite promising, but there's always a but. The leaf drop in all of those other applications was significantly higher than ethyl alone, which is why we've never really recommended the use of those adjuvants with Ethephon. It's always Ethephon now with the wetter. We did a bit more work with phosphates to see if you could use them alone, and the answer is pretty much no. Phosphates alone are pretty much the same as controls. Urea and an alternate phosphate source, pretty much the same as the control. So phosphates alone are not doing it for macadamias, although they did in some applications and other crops. Something else we noticed over time is that as the season progresses, the trees become more sensitized to the Ethephon application. This is the same orchard, a couple of rows apart, but one lot sprayed in April and one lot in June. If you look at the April drop, very few nuts. June drop, quite a significant drop. So yeah, the timing of the application is quite important for us. The later you go in the season, the better. But you don't want to be spraying when flowering is coming in. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. For Beaumont, for us, Ethephon is registered primarily on Beaumont, and it's always been about Beaumont. I know for you it's other cultivars. For us, Beaumont traditionally was always stripped in the late part of the season. We tend to pick up the intakes first, get that through the bins, get it to the processors, and Beaumont harvesting starts once most of the intakes, the naturally dropping intakes are harvested. So for us, the fact that it works better in late season was probably beneficial. We also did a bit of work on other cultivars. In this instance, 816, we sprayed in the same week in Barberton, which is one of our cooler areas, and in Hazyview, which was one of our warmer growing areas. The Hazyview area is generally advanced on the Barberton area. In Barberton with 816, with increasing rates of Ethephon, we got an increased response, but never more than about 40% drop. When we applied the same rates in the Hazyview area, even the lowest rates were giving us a 70% drop, but you can see that natural drop was in progress in the 816s. We did the same work with 788 in the same week on the same farms. Barberton area, again, a dose-responsive effect in 816 in Barberton, going up to about 70% drop. And in hazy view, yeah, not so dose responsive with 788, and we were getting again a natural drop. So the controls were dropping naturally in hazy view while they weren't in Barberton. Okay, there's some unintended consequences to Ethephon use. One is that leaf abscission, and what arises from leaf abscission. Our first thoughts were, with all those leaves coming off, we're looking at a potential future loss in yield with less leaves on the tree. I've put that chart up. That's just to highlight the amount of leaf that drops. That's a chart of long-term use of Ethephon on one orchard, and in that one orchard, it's always the same trees sprayed and the same trees unsprayed. And you can see over a 6-year period, this is an irrigated orchard, by the way, over a 6-year period, while at year 1, where we made the first application, the two were about the same. Thereafter, while not significantly different, the Ethephon spray trees always produced a little more. Possibly that's because of the leaf drop. Beaumont is an extremely dense tree with a lot of old leaves in the center. The Ethephon tends to drop those older leaves from the center, open up the canopy a bit, let more light into the tree. You tend to get a bit more flowering inside. So yeah, there are benefits to that leaf drop. However, this data is from 3 orchards on the same farm, but that farm is over an extensive area. In 2003, we applied Ethephon to these 3 orchards. You'll see from 2003 to 2004, we've got an increase in the control trees, but where we sprayed Ethephon, we got a slight decline in yield. In orchard 2, from year 1 to 2, we've got again a slight increase in the controls, and the sprayed trees a not so slight decrease. And in orchard 3, the controls and the Ethephon yielded about the same from both years. What's significant is that 3rd orchard was irrigated. The other 2 are on the highline part of the farm where they can't pump water to. Those were non-irrigated. And what else is significant about that is 2003, when we applied the Ethephon, was one of our driest years on record in the last 100 years. There's that brown line is 2003. It's about the 3rd lowest rainfall we've had in the area in that 100-year history. The year before, it was also below normal. So one of the things for your information that we can possibly draw from this is Ethephon in a dry year or a very dry year is probably going to give you a knock in the future. That's just to highlight what it looks like. All those leaves that fell off that were on a chart, there it is on a picture. Controls sprayed. That shows after Ethephon application the yellowing of leaves in the inside of the canopy. Those are the leaves that drop, the old ones. One of the things we do in South Africa where we weren't using Ethephon at that time is to strip by hand. It's quite a destructive process. A lot of labourers go in with sticks and they beat the trees until the nuts are beaten out. And if we looked at the amount of leaf drop on those manual stripping compared to Ethephon, and this was in a Barberton site, there's often not much of a difference between the leaf loss. So for us, Ethephon is not giving us any more leaf loss than we would have had anyway without it. There's other unintended consequences. We sprayed a few more cultivars to see what happens. 791 in particular, we noticed a drop of young soft leaves from a new flush. 788, a drop of young leaves from a newly hardened flush. That's just to show you where the leaves have dropped. So yes, there's some cultivars where you would expect certain organs like new leaves not to be sensitized to Ethephon. They are. So you've got to be careful with new cultivars. Another unintended consequence, and this is many years after we finished our Ethephon work, I got a call out to a farm where the grower had sprayed late in the season, too late in the season. Flower bud swell had commenced, and you can see a lot of those flowers have dried up and died. So big negative effect for late season applications. That's why you can't go too late. Okay, so max and drought stress. We've said potentially under drought stress you're going to have some negative effects, but how do you recognize when your max are under drought stress? I think there's some people in the audience today, certainly, who might be more qualified to answer that one than me. And some questions on how do we ameliorate stress. The problem with Macs is they don't really wilt. They've got fairly stiff lignified leaves. They lose water, they maintain their position in the canopy. An avocado, for example, you put under water stress and you'll see the leaves start drooping. Lychees you put under stress, severe stress, and you'll often see a yellowing or even a browning of the leaves. There's no real quick visible way to tell. The other thing is Macs have coping mechanisms for water loss. They close their stomata fairly quickly to conserve water. So yeah, a bit difficult to say when they're under stress. One of the ways we could consider is with soil moisture, but again, that's going to depend on the soil type. So yeah, that's going to be orchard specific, area specific. Stem xylem potential, that work is being done in South Africa at the moment. There's 2 or 3 researchers working on plant-water relations. I think they're getting closer to having some good answers in relation to stem water xylem potential. The good thing about stem xylem water potential, although a method we've used in the lab and in the field for many years, is something that is applicable on farm. There's almond farmers in South Africa who are starting to measure it. There's apparatus that's, the apparatus we tend to use is large gas cylinders attached, but there's one where you've got a sort of a manual pump attached where you can operate it without carrying bulky equipment around, and that probably has potential on farm with a bit of training and assuming we can get a good correlation between the stem xylem potential and stress. There's other methods, but they're not applicable on farm. Ethylene can measure the presence of ethylene, stress-related proteins and metabolites, but that's not really relevant to what a grower can do. So what approach to take when you suspect your trees are under stress? Well, one thing to consider is a lower rate. We've already said that stressed trees are already producing ethylene. Do they need as much as you would normally put? Probably not, or possibly not. That lower rate can be put in a higher volume. That's an approach that's taken in South Africa when they use lower rates. Ethephon, at the higher concentrations, if you get a few drops on a nut, it's often going to cause abscission. But at the lower rates, you really want to ensure that all the nuts get a decent wetting. It's advised to monitor leaf drops, so if you're going to go in and display a potentially stressed orchard, start with a few rows and see what the response is in terms of leaf drop. If it's more than you're used to and more than you expect, it's probably something to avoid. Exceptionally hot days, when metabolism to ethylene is quicker, are probably best to avoid. You could consider under water restricting conditions of allocating additional water to trees that are going to receive Ethephon, and possibly spraying later in the season. We've already showed that the trees are more responsive in the late season. A long-term approach, you can go back to your records, see what happened in previous hot years compared to cool years. There's probably a lot of data on various farms that would be extremely useful. Something else you're going to need to do is observe flowering in spring, see if there's been a negative effect. Okay, trials of lower rates we've already spoken about, and we needed a practical parameter for stress. Sure. Okay, so what sort of research do we need? Well, cultivars that don't need Ethephon would be great. Alternate rates we've spoken about, adjuvants we've spoken about. There's some things you can do to ameliorate stress. Only one is really applicable or practical at this stage, and that's calcium. There are a lot of trials in process showing that salicylic acid relieves certain kind of stress. That's the active ingredient in aspirin. While that might be a cheap painkiller for humans, it's probably not cheap to apply on an orchard-sized basis. Looking at calcium, this is some work done in beans. If you look at application of Ethephon at that point to beans that have been treated with various amounts of calcium, you can see where no calcium was applied, 100% drop shortly afterwards, with 0.1 molar calcium, 0 leaf drop quite far down the line. So calcium in the leaf abscission zone will prevent abscission. Are there ways we can apply calcium to trees that will put it into the leaf abscission zones but not the nut abscission zones? That's something to consider. I've put up a little bit about salicylic acid and the various crops it's been used in. Not macadamia, unfortunately. So yes, there's lots of potential to research this sort of issue. And that's my story for today. Some acknowledgements to the AMS and my funders, the ARC and SAMAC. Thanks.
Are there any questions for Mark?
Yeah, Mark, the total leaf drop when you
Hang on,
As I said, I'm deaf as a doornail, so I won't hear you from there.
So the total leaf drop, did ethyl just speed up the leaf drop, or was there more leaf drop over like the 6 month period?
In Beaumont.
Yeah.
Yes, no, definitely. Beaumonts don't drop their leaves if you don't spray ethyl.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about 816s?
Oh, 816 is a different story. They have some natural leaf drop. Put ethyl in and you get a leaf drop like you're worried you've killed your trees. And the leaves that don't drop all turn yellow. But with us, 816 is naturally quite a lot more yellow than other varieties. So there's something going on in 816 we're not sure about. But yes, I advise in South Africa at the moment to don't spray 816. Yeah.
Mark, sometimes you get a yield increase after you apply Ethephon or ethyl. And one thought is that knocking out those old leaves is a good thing. The other thing I've heard from other people is maybe knocking the crop down early is a good thing. So I was wondering where you've got those, like the urea adjuvants, and you've got more leaf drop, did you get an impression whether that was good for yield or bad for yield, that you're knocking a lot more leaves out?
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Yes, in that trial where we looked at the adjuvants, we didn't follow yield in the following year, unfortunately, so I really can't comment. My impression is the urea promoted the uptake of Ethephon into the leaves. But yeah, effect on yield I can't say.
On your data modelling for the future of where to grow macadamias in South Africa,
Yes.
have you considered the factor of urban sprawl and humans taking over the habitable land for trees?
Okay, that modelling takes no urban sprawl into account. It's based entirely on weather.
I've just got a quick question about spray coverage. Have you noticed that the efficacy of the Ethephon is better if you get a better spray coverage to not?
Yeah, spray coverage is quite a big issue. A lot of our growers, there's a split in our growers between those who have mist blowing type equipment and those who do their Ethephon applications by hand. And funnily enough, on some farms that have both, they prefer the hand applications because of the wetting it gives them. That's based on their on-farm observations. We've never compared the application methods. Yeah.
I'm sure you have more questions, and you're welcome to ask Mark. We'll give him a break to out of the heat.